It's the Autosport podcast. We talk about Formula One's plans for noisy cut-price engines and look ahead to the Chinese Grand Prix. With the fallout from Sebastian Vettel's Australian Grand Prix victory still echoing around the Formula One world, the big news this week is the plan to adopt a new high-noise, low-cost engine formula in 2021. What exactly this means is sure to be a big talking point in the build-up to this weekend's Chinese Grand Prix. My name is Edd Straw, the Editor-in-Chief of Autosport, and joining me in what can only be called a very high-powered edition of the Autosport podcast is Anthony Rowlinson, the Editorial Director of Autosport and F1 Racing, among others. Better known as Prof, given his resemblance to Le Professeur himself, Alain Prost. What I want to know is whether or not you had one of your run-ins with another of your lookalikes, Leo Sayer, in Australia.
Disappointingly, he wasn't in Melbourne this year, and I say that with a heavy heart because it's a moment of the year I always look forward to, which is a bit of a man hug with Leo in the paddock.
Do you ever just sort of walk past a reflective surface and think, there he is, and then realise no?
No, what normally happens is I get about 55 text messages saying your dad's in the paddock, and I have to run down and stage it for the photographers.
Have the annual photo.
Yes.
I'm sure he enjoys spending a few minutes.
Well, we've become sort of slightly friendly because of it. But happily sees the funny side.
Normally the story should be close friends rather than slightly friendly, but...
Alain Prost doesn't think it's funny.
Oh, he wouldn't.
No, when I've sat with him and interviewed him, he stonewalls the gag, but Leo Sayer thinks it's very funny.
That says a lot about them. Also joining me is our European Editor-in-Chief and the man currently in the editor's hot seat at F1 Racing, Damien Smith. This is his first appearance on this incarnation of the Autosport podcast, although as this is his third stint in the orbit of Autosport, he knows his way round. You've been back a few months now, so how are you finding it?
Yeah, it's good to be back. Lots of very familiar faces, a few new ones. It's interesting in the last 10 years how Autosport's changed. The emphasis so heavily on the website now compared to the print magazine back in my last time here. And of course the website's come on so strongly in the time I've been gone. So very different time. Same problems, same interesting situations to deal with week in, week out, but generally it's very good to be back.
You mean challenges, don't you? Not problems.
Challenges. Sorry, that's the modern way, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
Opportunities.
Opportunities.
That's the correct corporate term.
Exactly.
No such thing as a problem. So getting back to the big news of the past few days, the FIA has revealed this intention to ditch the current 1.6 litre turbocharged V6 plus ERS package in favour of this low-cost and noisier engine. Anthony, there's still a lot of detail to be ironed out. So what exactly is the plan? Where does it go from here? What's the substance of this statement?
The short answer is I don't know. What I can say is that it's clearly a topic that's going to be something that runs and runs now. It's going to be one of the main technical questions that we're faced with because Ross Brawn in Melbourne made a point of briefing us all saying that a new engine formula was on the cards for 2020 or 2021. Now we've got this idea that engines need to be noisy, which is a great thing for us to hear in principle, but we just don't know where it'll go. I mean, if the manufacturers remain involved in Formula One as they are, they're going to want something that's road relevant, which means probably some kind of hybrid type engine. Whether it's a high rev screamer or not, I don't know. I mean, I actually think the current engines sound pretty good, and a lot of the criticism that was made of them 2 years ago, I think, has gone away. If you stand trackside as you always do at races, they're good sounding engines. They don't burst your eardrums anymore, but it sounds like a proper racing engine now.
Yeah, one of the interesting things at the weekend in Australia was obviously Jean Todt made a sort of sweeping comment about the public not accepting loud engine noises anymore. Quite how he knows that, I don't know, but he made that statement. Ross Brawn, in a typically frank and very straight press conference he gave, seemed to suggest that a racing engine should have some sort of noise to it and some sort of oral quality. There's some clashing of opinion at the very top of our sport at the moment, I think, between the FIA and FOM, and also the control factor of who's going to write these rules, who's going to implement them. That's all going to play out. And of course, these two are old allies from the Ferrari days, so it's quite interesting dynamic to see how that's going to work out. But I agree with Prof, actually, that the cars sound quite good at the moment. I mean, standing trackside at turns 11 and 12 in Albert Park, they don't burst your eardrums like they used to. but they do sound like racing cars, and I think they've got quite a good sound to them.
Apart from the Honda, which sounds like it's going to explode on up changes, and that's not an exaggeration. It actually sounds like it's going to self-detonate when it's moving up the rev range.
It does make you sort of nervous every time it goes. You think, oh, is this hit again? You know.
And as we said when we were there, if that was your own car, you'd be straight down to Quick Fit saying, "Please fix my broken car."
Absolutely, yeah.
It's not nice.
No.
The noise is the interesting question. There's kind of the level of noise versus the quality of noise. I know, Damien, you wrote a column after the Australian Grand Prix that ran in Autosport when you said that the noise is the only ingredient missing from the old shock and awe F1. Now, I tend to agree that actually the volume is secondary to the quality of the noise. I'm happy with them being a bit quieter, but a bit more textured. They're still impressive when you're there. So that maybe for me personally isn't that important, but the groundswell of opinion seems to be that you want that noise, that impressive, smash you in the face, really grab you and say this is seriously powerful. And I know some teams have said that's a great thing for sponsors and partners, just to sort of say this is something really impressive. So how do those things get balanced up?
It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, I think that quote came from I asked Alonso in a press conference how these cars compared to the V10 era when he was winning world championships, and are they comparable? And essentially the quote I used in the Autosport column was, yes, they do compare well, but he brought up the point that the noise factor is the thing that's missing. I look back to when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, and the shock and awe factor of Formula One was definitely there. That as a little kid, it was quite scary. You had to kind of steel yourself when the F1 cars came out to get used to it again. And at the end of the race, you remember never being able to hear the commentator on the tannoy. You'd hear the first lap, then they'd all come past. And then once the cars all got strung out, you wouldn't hear the commentator again until the slowing down lap. And he's still talking. Excellent, So, but that was part of the sport then. Is it still part of the sport now? I don't know. I mean, this is a very subjective subject. My son, for example, who's 12, I started taking him to races in the V8 era, and those V8s were really harsh on the ears and not particularly nice sound. The V10s, I think, were even harsher actually, but the V8s they just hurt your ears. And they all sounded the same, which is another key thing about these engines. Now he actually prefers watching F1 cars because they don't hurt his ears anymore, and he can even talk to me while they're on the circuit. Now you could argue that's a good thing or a bad thing. For him, it's a good thing. So I think different generation. There's different generation growing up now with different requirements or expectations of what Formula One should be. We shouldn't necessarily listen to the old guard on this.
Without wishing to, for one moment, be the voice of the old guard, but in Melbourne every year they have a flypast by an F-18 Hornet, and the thing comes from nowhere. You don't see it coming. It flies past at several hundred miles an hour, and it makes you, I won't use the actual phrase, but it stops you in your tracks. All you can do is stand there petrified at this machine that's flown overhead at incredible volume, and you're just sitting there with your fingers in your ears. And the thrill of it never goes away, or the distraction of it. Plenty of people in the paddock don't like it, but that's completely gone from F1. That, just use that by way of example. And I still think the visceral element, that just that sheer, that thunder of noise that you used to get with Formula One, it would just, you'd have a headache when you spent a day at the track, and you go away sort of slight ringing in your ears. You had to have earplugs with you at all times, and I miss it, and unashamedly I miss it, and I think the sport's the poorer for it.
I think that element of that event, that's something that makes Formula One motor racing stand out from anything else that you can actually go and see it as a live sport. The sound is important to it, and I do agree. I do agree that it's missing, but I'm not sure how important it is, as I say, for the next generation of fan, whether they need it or expect it. I mean, it's interesting talking to someone like Nigel Roebuck about this, given that he's supposed to be one of the old guard, but he's not bothered by the noise or the lack of noise, because it's for him it's the quality of noise is what matters, and
which I'd agree with completely.
Yeah, and he talks about particularly looking back at the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, when you had a mixture of different types of engine making different noises, and you could always hear a V12 Ferrari from a DFV, and you could certainly hear a Matra V12 compared to anything else on the grid in those days. And it was the quality of noise, and he didn't like the V8s. He thought they were just a rather shrill, unpleasant sound. So it's not about volume.
I think the other point as well is that a lot of the criticism comes from people who never have the opportunity to actually see the cars live, and I do think that the television coverage doesn't do the noise that's there justice. I guess this is related to the point Alex Wirtz recently talked about, with the camera angles that are taken not really showing the speed of Formula One cars. And I do also feel that the way the sound is conveyed, it does sound more weedy on television than it does if you're standing trackside. So I think there's also a question there of how best to transmit that back to the vast majority of fans who are watching at home, who at best might get to hear that noise a few times a year.
When we were in Melbourne, we were invited to a screening of the new Bruce McLaren movie. We're under embargo about it, actually, so we can't say much about it.
So you weren't invited to?
No, we are allowed to say that we were there and that it's been made, I think. But there's a lot of race footage in it, particularly of the Can-Am cars of the late 60s. And I think, if I'm right, they had 7-litre V8s. And that stuff in a cinema surround sound experience was amazing. I mean, you just felt the thunder of these engines through your body.
I can top that because I was once testing at Silverstone in my MX-5, just little production-y road car, and I heard this rumbling behind me on a test day, and it was a McLaren Can-Am car. Came up behind me, pulled in front of me, and then went into cops. And to be right behind, that thing blasting you full pelt in the face was absolutely unbelievable.
But to me, that's absolutely what the sport's about. And the cars have to be big, fast, thrilling, visceral, all that stuff, hit you in the guts. I personally, I'm not actually that worried about the quality of the sound. I just want noise. I actually just want volume.
Can we just get you to, while you're watching, just have someone screaming in your ear all the way through?
It's like working with you.
That's fair, isn't it? Yeah, that's fair. I can't argue with that one.
I mean, if you go to one of the big historic race meetings these days, you get a reminder of what it used to be like. You see a Masters F1 race with DFV powered cars, or one of the Can-Am races they hold every now and again, and it is the element of the sport that seems to have gone forever, as Alonso said in that quote, which is rather sad. Personally, I'm with Prof. I would love to see them back being properly noisy and scaring people. The sensible side of me thinks maybe times have changed and things have moved on, and that it's impossible to go back to that. But I think Ross Brawn he's got the toughest job. He's got to find some line to walk between these two sort of extremes, really. And he's also got to come up with something that I think car manufacturers are supposed to be interested in, because whether we like it or not, it seems that car manufacturers have to be courted to be part of Formula One. I quite like the idea of an irrelevant Formula One that no longer has to count towards what car manufacturers are looking for.
Well, shorn of the need for road relevance and the marketing demands,
that does appeal. But does that mean that all the car manufacturers are going to go to Formula E or something else, and that Formula One will be left out in the cold, and then Formula One will slowly dwindle? That's the danger, I guess, of being irrelevant. It's a really tough one. I'm not saying there's not a straight answer to it, really.
I do think that was kind of summed up in the way that it's been expressed what the plan is, because you've got low cost, so that's one element. You've got road relevant, you've got noisy, and all of these things are kind of conflicting with each other. Because if you want to make it genuinely road relevant, marketing budgets for car manufacturers is one thing. If they're spending marketing money and that's all they worry about, all they really want to say is that's a Mercedes or that's a Ferrari engine winning. But when you're talking about road relevance in technology, presumably you're meaning R&D. And by definition, if you're doing R&D, it's going to cost some money, isn't it? Because you're exploring new areas. So that the worry is, like you say, Ross Brawn's got to kind of walk that line. But you kind of end up playing with too many dimensions for them all to have kind of a sweet spot in the middle.
But this comes back to a point that we all talked about before, which is that this is all predicated on the notion that you have to have manufacturers involved in Formula One, and that the sport has to please manufacturers. And actually, it doesn't at all. It's just the way that we've ended up. And there's actually, in my view, and it's only an opinion, there's far too much money in the sport. There's far too much being spent on it, and the level of complexity and, if you like, artificiality that's inside Formula One is actually to its detriment. And it doesn't have to be like that. It's just the way it is.
Well, this is the question, I guess, if you can go back to what you might call more specialised non-manufacturer engine builders. Cosworth, I guess, being the ultimate example. Brian Hart was still having success with his engine in the 90s. Gary Anderson, our technical expert, speaks very highly of the work he did, and they had some great results with Jordan in 94. So that's, I guess, what we're pointing towards, isn't it? Are the manufacturers needed? But then again, of course, it comes down to a financial side. The manufacturers are one of the few organisations that are pouring money still into Formula One. They'll have played a part in the framing of these, regulations, in the framing of the vague direction. But basically, you can read the objectives any way you want, really, at the moment. It's almost at best it's sort of a very vague signpost that sort of says, well, over there it'll be something like this.
I would be surprised if Ross Brawn's priority out of all those things that you've mentioned isn't the cost, bringing the cost down as being, and he did mention it in Melbourne.
Which they did quite effectively in the V8 era when they froze it and the manufacturers had to agree to do low price engine deals.
It can be done, definitely, and we've seen it in other formulas that you can produce engines at you don't have to be a $20 million supply, and also from an Autosport reader point of view, I would think the main interest would be to make it more competitive so that an Elmore or a Cosworth can compete against a car manufacturer. It does come down to capping costs and whether that's achievable and whether it's actually practical. And also, this is going to be a test of what Liberty Media, or Formula One Group as they are now known, really what they want to get out of this sport. Because if they want it to be a revenue generator the way that CVC did in the past, then of course they'll want to attract car manufacturers and massive investment.
They certainly want to make a profit, there's no doubt about that.
But if they genuinely want to make an entertaining sport and one that opens up competition, then car manufacturers aren't the answer. It's the opposite, actually.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? Because you talk about the level of investment needed, but that's because the cost base is so high. These engines are amazing, and you shouldn't knock them as pieces of technological architecture, if you like, but they don't need to be that good. No. They don't need to be that sophisticated. Teams don't need 1,000 people to run as efficient Formula One teams. It's just become an arms race. And the fear is that I think this season actually we'll see it even more. I think we'll see Ferrari and Mercedes go absolutely head-to-head this year.
Yeah.
And I think I shudder to imagine what their true budgets are, because we get pretty close to seeing kind of what their budgets are, and it's the thick end of $500 million. I bet you it's well north of that by the end of this season.
Yeah, it's an arms race, absolutely.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Unless you can control it, that's always going to be the case, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. In the new issue of F1 Racing, which we're in the middle of finishing at the moment.
Outstanding plug. Go out and buy it now. No, don't buy it now. Go out and buy it in a few days when it's actually on the shelves. Buy the previous issue now, next issue in a few days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've written a piece about McLaren and their current situation they find themselves in. And in Melbourne, I sort of tried to suggest to Zach Brown that maybe Britain's version of Ferrari, which is what McLaren essentially is these days, could possibly build their own engines to supply to their to their own team and to other teams, as a Cosworth does and as an Ilmore does or did in the past. He gave it kind of short shrift, but I think there's merit in that idea that actually a team like McLaren that builds these fantastic road cars and produces engines, albeit with outside supply help, could build racing engines for Formula One. I think that's actually what a company like McLaren should be aiming for. But obviously, they'd have to only can do it if it's viable from a financial point of view, and they can be competitive. And the current engines, absolutely no way, can't happen. But we've got this opportunity now in 2020 or 21, whenever it is that the engine comes in, to actually come up with something that's sustainable, that sounds right, that is powerful enough. The relevance thing, that's the hard thing, I think. That's the thing, is being relevant to car manufacturers. Because these modern engines, let's face it, from a technological point of view, how relevant are they? I mean, that's a moot point, isn't it?
We're certainly not at the point where things are being bolted off the F1 engine and put onto road cars. There's lots of fairly sort of tenuous connections, aren't there? But it's I'm not sure there's that many road car manufacturers who are specifically investing in the engines to directly port technology. Maybe a few techniques, a few things, but
it's a marketing tool, Formula One.
Marketing
surely.
First and foremost, yeah.
On your point about power, I had a very interesting chat with Paddy Lowe last week for a piece that will go in the next issue of F1 Racing. We got talking about the level of sophistication of the current F1 cars, and he made the point that the engines are basically more powerful now than anything since the qualifying engines of the mid-80s. So race spec current Formula 1 engines are the most powerful we've ever had. There's way more downforce on the cars than there has ever been. There's far more technology on them than there has ever been. They're bigger and they're heavier, but they're not actually much faster because of the weight that's involved. They're tipping fully fueled with the driver on. They're nudging the upper end of 800 kilos, as in nearly 900 kilos now, which is not far off an LMP1 car. So this idea that Formula 1's become an arms race and there's technological overkill, I think is absolutely valid. And I think the sport's actually, although these cars are amazing to watch now, I think the sport's just moving in completely the wrong direction. It's everything that Formula 1 isn't, actually. If you think about the 60s and Chapman and adding lightness and simplicity and speed, it's just like this insane overkill now, and it doesn't have to be like that.
Actually, the weight's an interesting consideration, because a big chunk of that is from the engines. There is a little bit from the advanced crash structures and that kind of thing. The safety measures do add some weight on, just as they do with regular road cars. But in terms of the visuals of the car, the way the cars behave on track, if you've got a car that's 150 kilos, 200 kilos lighter, it's going to look much more alive and less wallowy straight away. So that's an area where potentially you can improve things. You think back to the old days of Grand Prix racing when you had a weight formula. Can be have a maximum weight formula, minimum weight formula. There's all sorts of different approaches you can take to try and achieve that within safety ground. So it'd be interesting to see whether some of these things are created, because I always feel that sometimes if you can avoid prescribing lots of things in the regulations, if you can try and create something that creates the overall conditions that should lead to the outcome you want, then sometimes that's a better path to take than trying to engineer every aspect of it, because then the law of unintended consequences just chases you around and you end up going nowhere, which is probably the sort of circle that F1's found itself in at times.
The good news for this year is that the cars look good on the circuit and they look fast again. But I must say, over the course of the weekend, your brain kind of gets used to it and it gets less exciting. The first few moments of Friday practice in Melbourne, start of a new era, the drivers were trying to find their limits as well and were overcooking it into turn 11 as well, and there were sparks flying off the bottom of the cars, and that was genuinely exciting. Proper Formula One cars back as they should be, and they look in proportion this year as well, which definitely helps. Over the course of a race distance, of course, the visual element kind of recedes and they're less exciting. But then again, that was always the case back in the day as well. So that's the way it is. But genuinely, I think they've managed, from a very ill thought through idea, they've scrabbled together something that's pretty good. But
there's a step, isn't there? It's not as big as it could have been, but at least it's not a retrograde step. But
Ross Brawn recognises it. I think we've all recognised it in our magazines and our columns on the website, that these rules, there was no real proper brief, and a couple of off-the-cuff remarks seem to have formed the basis of a rulebook, which is crazy.
Well, a couple of people have made the point that if you actually strip away the suspension and the wings package, which are obviously visually very different, the fundamentals of the 17 cars are very similar to what we've just had. So the monocoques are effectively the same, the power units are the same. So it's kind of like an aftermarket bolt-on fix, go faster stripes and wide wheels. I mean, and they do look cool. It's very dismissive, really. I shouldn't be so dismissive. And the drivers are enjoying them, which is probably the most important thing of all. But it's not. It kind of feels a bit kind of Heath Robinson, if you like, that it's been sort of retrofitted F1 rather than this is the way it should be. But that's Ross's challenge now, isn't it? That's what he's set upon himself to take on.
I do think there is a point, though, about it being the right direction if the drivers like it. The drivers quite liked the era we had 10, 12 years ago when you could go flat out, refueling, really were sprint races. And yet there were still fan complaints that it was boring because it wasn't really... The brilliance of the drivers wasn't really being conveyed. The passes were being made strategically, etc. So it's really difficult, because the danger is you take a situation, you say, well, that's not right, that should be that way. Then you change all the things, and then you end up with people saying, well, actually, it should be back to that. How long is it going to be before people say, well, maybe if we had narrower tyres and the cars would move around a bit more? You sort of get this endless circle of change.
We're currently running this fan survey across the Motorsport network, and it'll be interesting to see what we pull out from that survey in terms of what the fans expect from Formula One and what they want from Formula One. The basis of that doesn't necessarily need to form the foundation of the new rules, but it should give Ross Brawn and his group the indications. It probably will confirm what they already know, because these guys know what Formula One should be anyway. The other positive thing that I pulled from Melbourne was that the right man is absolutely in the right job in that situation. I can't think of anyone better than Ross Brawn, with the knowledge he has and the experience he has. There was a great moment when he was asked, are you a poacher turned gamekeeper? Which he clearly is, and he just said yes with a big grin on his face. He knows where how it was all done, and back in the last 20 years, he knows exactly how it was all done. All the little
tricks of the trade.
Yes, I was going to say cheats, but that's probably the wrong word. But you know what I mean. The things that got around.
Cutting room floor.
I always like to say that you have legal cars, you have illegal cars and you have not illegal cars.
Exactly.
Which aren't necessarily legal, but not illegal cars will normally be the best ones. But
I think Ross has got a big challenge though on his hands, because everyone was playing nicely in Melbourne. Nobody wanted to get the season off on a sour note. But Jean Todt had a press conference as well, and one of the points that came out was that it's the FIA that writes the sporting and technical regulations for Formula One, and he's just sort of drawing a nice little boundary.
Bit of turf war.
Absolutely, turf warfare, and
that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah,
that battle. And
Dieter Renken, who obviously writes for both our titles, made a very, very interesting point. I won't attempt to do his South African accent.
It's all right. He's not very good at it either.
He made the point that Jean Todt will always view Ross Brawn as an employee, and the dynamic in their relationship, at least in Jean Todt's eyes, will always be that of boss and employee. So let's see how that one parlays out over the next year.
I always think you need to give your bosses a hard time, though.
I'm sure Ross is quite capable of doing that, I'm sure.
I like the sound of him. But yes, the point Damien makes about the survey, if you head to f1survey.motorsport.com, there's a chance for you to have your say. And I would urge anybody who hasn't yet filled it in to head there. It's open. It was launched on the day of the Australian Grand Prix, and it's open for 2 weeks. So you've got another few days.
It takes us through the Chinese Grand Prix.
So it's well worth having your say, and then the answers and the findings will be presented to the people arguably in a position to make changes for the better. It's also worth having a look ahead to the Chinese Grand Prix, I think. It's not just engine noise and rules. We had a fascinating Australian Grand Prix. There's still this one question, Ferrari or Mercedes, who is really faster? Obviously, Ferrari had the pace in the race in Australia, but it was Mercedes in qualifying. Did we know enough from that race weekend to decide if that's the pattern or if that's just a one-off because Albert Park's an unusual circuit? For me, it's quite hard to tell.
Yep, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I mean, I think just looking at Ferrari's pace for a minute, the bit that stood out for me was actually the fact that Seb split the Mercs in qualifying, and Valtteri was closer to Lewis than Nico had ever been around Albert Park. So Seb's qualifying performance was actually exceptionally strong, and the race pace spoke for itself, I think. And I think it's interesting now that Mercedes, clearly they're being pushed by Ferrari. They certainly were in Albert Park. And there's a recurrence of an old weakness, which was the rear tyre wear overheating issue, which we haven't seen for the last 3 seasons, probably because they've had such an innate performance advantage. They haven't been into that little critical zone. I wonder if now a fundamental flaw has been exposed. We will see. We'll see it play out. But
when you've got a big advantage, that covers a lot of vices. Yeah.
And reliability will start coming into it, because obviously one of the reasons for Merck's amazing reliability record for the last 3 years has been they haven't had to push the car to the limit. So Ferrari, I think, will push them to the limit.
The interesting question is the operating window of the Ferrari, if you like, because obviously the ultimate pace, Hamilton had a tiny bit more. In the second stint, Bottas on the soft tyre was actually the quickest of them, whereas Vettel was just pretty quick on both. So that maybe suggests that the Ferrari is a pretty strong car kind of across the board. So could we see Ferrari sort of being always at that level through the year, and then Mercedes maybe having good days and bad days? And then it's just a question of where Australia actually falls on that spectrum. If Australia was as bad as it gets for Mercedes, they're going to have a pretty good season. But if that's as good as it gets, then Ferrari's going to have an amazing season.
That's what we took from testing as well, wasn't it? Pre-season testing, the Ferrari is very consistent. So hopefully that's exactly the picture we could end up with, that Ferrari is pretty solid everywhere it goes, but it's pushing Mercedes to the point where it breaks or is pushed into the zone that it hasn't been in for a while, and we see some weaknesses.
This year's Ferrari is fundamentally, you probably couldn't call it a James Allison car, but James Allison would have had a big input into its design,
and also his approach technically
exactly, and this
would have been
kind
there.
And it kind of echoed the Lotuses that he did in 12 and 13, which were always super consistent on tyre performance. And if we're seeing that from the Ferrari, then maybe there is a clear James Allison influence in that car, and that's the kind of performance we'll see from this year's Ferrari.
But of course, if you want to take the negative view of that, obviously Kimi Raikkonen won in Australia in 2013 on tyre management and didn't win again. I don't think that's going to happen to Ferrari, but it kind of adds to the idea that Australia is just a little bit of an outlier.
But in the early laps, Vettel was pushing Hamilton just on pure pace. I mean, they were really going at it. Those first 18 laps, that was a proper full-on race, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was great to see.
Seb was saying afterwards, I knew I had to push. I knew I had to keep him, within a second. I don't think Lewis got more than 2 seconds away, did he? Yeah.
No, and you could tell certainly from the radio language that Lewis was having with his engineer, he was uncomfortable because he couldn't break him. He couldn't get away and make that gap that he wanted to get. It was a proper race.
And it's going to be interesting to see what happens China-wise. Very different circuit, many more sort of longer corners. it's one step harder on the tyres. So I think it's the super soft, soft and medium have been allocated by Pirelli, whereas we had the ultra softs in Australia. So there's another factor that's changed a little bit. Theoretically, that could help Mercedes a little bit if they're struggling on the tyre life. But there's all these factors that are changing that just means it's almost like another first race, isn't it? We don't really know what could happen. The fascinating thing will be is if we could see a scenario where Mercedes has an advantage in qualifying. And by some estimates, they've still got a couple of tenths in their pocket just from the qualifying setting of the power unit. Obviously, everyone's got 100% ways of running their engine in qualifying, but Mercedes have always seemed to find a little bit more. So you could end up with this scenario where Mercedes often starts with track position, but the Ferrari's a bit stronger. And then if you have one-stop races, Mercedes aren't always going to make strategic errors that open a door quite as inviting as in Australia. So there could be a lot of cat and mouse going on here, couldn't there?
Yeah, I think so. And the nice thing as well also is that with the new rules, although a wider picture of form will emerge in the next few races, every race will be an element of unknown on these tyres and in this specification. So I think there's a lot to look forward to this year.
I guess the one disappointment is still we're not going to see Red Bull up there for a while. There's some
I was surprised
upgrades coming in Spain.
I was surprised actually at how fundamentally off the pace they looked, and you've got to wonder whether this, the rear suspension asymmetric valve return system has actually affected their performance much more than they would admit. Obviously, they wouldn't admit it if it had, but you've got to wonder when something that significant happens in a team that sort of prides itself on technological sophistication, if you like, and a lot of error, trickery, and very fine margins in that particular aspect of performance. Actually, whether it really has affected them. I mean, one thing you never see. When did you last see Dan Ricciardo spin off out of control? And you saw that pretty clearly in qualifying, and that surely was because of a chassis imbalance, or just he didn't feel comfortable in the car. They just looked well out of it. Comfortably third, nowhere near the first two.
The rear of that car certainly looked a little bit badly behaved. No, watching and testing, there were times when feeding in the power, the rear wasn't really staying in line. It didn't look perfect. The drivers have said it's just not quite there on downforce. So while the Renault power unit package is a clear relative weak point, particularly with the fact they're having to use the previous year's spec MG UK across all the Renault engine cars, and that's likely to be the case till probably Spain when they've got the next new batch of engines coming in. But that doesn't mean that I think it's just going to be bolt in an engine upgrade and away they go. There seems to be a car deficit they need to make up there.
Yeah, and we really didn't expect that this year of all years with a new rule book and Adrian Newey very much back in harness at Red Bull. So it's hard to believe that by mid-season they won't be back in there mixing it with Ferrari and Mercedes. But yeah,
it's too late by then, isn't it?
It is too late by then.
Too late for the title. Yeah.
But we just hope that maybe they can mix things up in terms of race results, getting and be an added complication in what hopefully will be a good title battle between the top two teams.
You know they're going to be a factor somewhere.
Surely, yeah.
There'll be a win somewhere around them.
Yeah. I mean, Monaco last year, Dan Ricciardo was amazing, and it all went wrong for him in the end. But he was absolutely the form man all weekend, wasn't he?
I think one of the things we were looking forward to this year was Max Verstappen taking on the next step in what's already been an incredible F1 career to this point. But if he hasn't got the car to do that, that would be a significant disappointment for the season. Again, it's hard to believe with Red Bull that they won't make progress, but we'll have to see.
What's the kind of expectation in terms of the kind of race we're going to see in Shanghai? Obviously, it's a very different type of circuit. There's a back straight that's just under 1.2 kilometres long. Very, very different to what you've got in Australia. So is passing going to be more achievable? Obviously, the DRS will be much more effective there in terms of how long that straight is, and we see a lot of passes into the hairpin, whereas we've never really seen that many passes at Albert Park. So if you end up with a similar situation, let's say it's Hamilton leading Vettel with the same performance pattern we saw in the first stint in Australia, would Vettel be in with a better chance of passing on track, or do we think it's going to end up still being a strategic issue?
I think it should be better. There should be a chance for Vettel to throw one up the inside into the hairpin. So I'm optimistic on that point. I mean, I watched the Australian Grand Prix trackside rather than in the press room, and from where I was standing, it was not a thrilling Grand Prix in the sense that the cars were quickly strung out. There were very few on-track battles, so you're essentially watching a largely reliable bunch of cars circulating on their own. And you had the odd battle that went on during the race with Ocon and Alonso together. But I had a very different perspective to the guys who were analysing the race from the media room, watching the timing screens. I think China, given the layout of that long straight, it should be better. We've all sort of held back judgment, I think, from Albert Park, because that's always been the way with those Australian Grand Prix. So I think that should be the case again.
One thing, the braking distances are shorter now, aren't they? There's more downforce and more grip as well. So whether the opportunities for passing are fundamentally less now, I think we'll sort of get a good indication of that in China. It's hard to predict, but I think it'll be quite a good test case.
One thing that Ross Brawn has said about is losing DRS at some point, which is something he really hates. But actually, while I would share that sentiment, you wouldn't want them to lose it now, because it's going to be needed. It's our only hope, really, I think, of overtaking.
This is something I've talked about before, so I won't go into it in too much depth. But actually, the DRS arguably could come into its own this year in terms of being what it was meant to be, to create contested braking zones. So obviously on the high deck tyres, if you've got tyres that are past their best, even if you're side by side going into the braking zone, you can't brake as effectively, you can't compete. But it might just be a little bit more balanced now, rather than the sort of drive-bys that we were seeing. If it's the right zone length, which obviously might require a little bit of tuning, it could actually turn out to be a positive thing, which would be remarkable given how unpopular it is.
One team that I don't think we'll see outbraking anybody is, sadly, McLaren Honda. I think this is going to really expose the weaknesses of their engine. That massive straight, I think it could be, we could just see Alonso and Stoffel just chugging away down the back, which is going to be painful actually, but I can't really see how it's going to be anything other than that.
At least they're not going to have to put too much effort into their mirrors and keeping people behind. But it's looking like that could be a real... almost back down to earth. It's amazing, isn't it? The fact that in the Australian Grand Prix that Alonso almost clung on for a point turns out to be this great. Oh, that was quite good feeling for McLaren. But I think that was a function of the circuit and Alonso doing a very good job. Whereas Shanghai, you look at it, you never know, they might have some fun with some Saubers, but you just can't see it being anything other than a really horrible weekend.
How do we see that panning out? I mean, you talked about Alonso a lot in the last podcast, but I mean, it's still an absolutely live issue, isn't it? Whether he'll stay there, whether it's just combustible, whether a man of that talent can put up with it any longer. I mean, what do you guys think?
I don't think he's going to see the season out unless there's a significant improvement. I think he'll walk before the end of the year.
If you can't see a future there,
no.
What's the point?
No, I mean, this is going out on a limb slightly here, but just watching his body language, seeing his face in Melbourne, that is a man that is in an utter fury, and he's hiding it behind this sort of bored, depressed-looking exterior. I mean, he did look actually clinically depressed at times, and during press conferences, just sort of idly looking out the window. He didn't want to be. He would have preferred to be anywhere other than sat there at that moment.
He also has a very good way of conveying what he thinks without necessarily the words he's saying. Conveying that. So I imagine he'll be adhering to, shall we say, the terms of his contract.
Absolutely.
Whilst communicating very emphatically what he thinks.
And the message he gave at the end of the race, that it was one of the best races he's ever driven. I mean, that was clearly, just in case you didn't notice, Mercedes and the rest of you, I'm still here and I'm still performing at my peak at the age of 35. He's a very clever guy who never says anything by mistake.
And I think there was a little bit of a barb at Honda there as well. Just to say, well, I almost got a point, but only because I'm a miracle worker.
Exactly.
So I think it ticked all the boxes.
There was an element of it's all about me, but actually, in his case, I think he can get away with it because it really is all about him.
Well, Alonso's not bad, is he? He's a pretty good Grand Prix. We know that in a championship contending car, he'd be able to win the championship. I guess that's the real big question for Alonso, and he's probably wondering the same thing. It's where's the opportunity to get into a strong car? He ended up with the McLaren Honda project because a few bridges have been burnt elsewhere. A few other teams are a bit wary of him because of the way he operates, and they already had top-line alternatives on board. So where does he go? If, let's say, he's out of McLaren either at the end of the season or before the end of the season, who's he going to be signing with? Red Bull is theoretically locked up for next year, and I don't think they'd be very keen on him.
Christian's always
Mercedes,
said no way.
Yeah, Mercedes. Obviously, Bottas could only be a one-year appointment, but they really need Alonso there. Well, they've got Hamilton.
Ferrari's theoretically possible, but you just can't ever see it happening.
The only advantage with Ferrari is that because there's been such a big change there over time, it's possible, but the way you look at it, you think, well, is it just going to have to be throw his lot in with the other works team, throw his lot in with Renault, with Enstone for a third time and try and win it there? But I guess that's the kind of great tragedy of Alonso almost, that he's just not been able to get himself into the right place at the right time. He should have 3, 4, 5 world championships, but he's further away from it than ever before.
The bit that frustrates me, I don't really actually care how many titles he wins or even how many races he wins, but I just miss not having him in the mix at the front. That's the bit that's sad and annoying. When you think about, I don't know, Valencia in 2012, he was just amazing. And we're just not seeing that. He's probably driving just as well, but he's doing it for 10th place and 11th place. And the sport's weaker for it. We're just missing this great thing. Yeah. And time's ticking by.
He'll know that this can't go on forever. There will be a point where his performance starts to drop off and trail off. And I think he just wants to get back to the front, win some more races, and ideally that third title. But it's not clear cut where he could go. It could end up just saying, well, I'm leaving McLaren, but I can't get in anywhere else. So is this a kind of Alan Prost year off and just see what happens, or what? It's a amazing situation for such a great driver to be in. You should think there really should be a battle to get him into the team, but because of the baggage perhaps that he brings, and because we're at a time when there's so many very good drivers, if you've got a Vettel or a Hamilton, you don't really need to think about Alonso. You can make do with what you've got, because you've got fantastic drivers. Red Bull have got Ricciardo, Verstappen, Carlos Sainz Jr. waiting in the wings. They hardly need to worry about it, do they?
He's in good company. Jim Clark only won 2 world championships, so yeah, exactly. So I agree absolutely that a driver's success in a career shouldn't be judged purely on titles and numbers, but the reality is that we're missing out on a great element to the racing, not having Alonso at the front. And it's a point that Lewis Hamilton made over the course of the Australian Grand Prix weekend that I think he misses having him to battle with.
The team that McLaren is likely to be battling at the back with is Sauber. Obviously, in Australia, Pascal Wehrlein dropped out after Friday practice, which let Antonio Giovinazzi into the car, and he did a very decent job, especially given he only had Saturday morning practice before heading into qualifying. And without a little error on his qualifying lap, he could have qualified even more strongly, maybe got out of Q1, which would have been really impressive. We've got the news that Wehrlein will again be sitting out China. This time they've taken that decision before the weekend, so Giovinazzi will get Friday. What do we make of all this? Are we looking forward to seeing Giovinazzi get another run? That's not necessarily to be negative about Wehrlein, but we know he's a very good young driver, whereas Giovinazzi is someone who it looked like he might not get an opportunity in F1, but now he's got a chance to continue to show what he can do.
Well, he laid down a marker, didn't he? I mean, he wasn't scared of it. Got straight in, qualified 16th, wasn't it? Or was it 17th? One off Q2, wasn't it? But I just think on the point of Wehrlein and Giovinazzi, I actually take the different view from the very well argued piece that's in Autosport.com that Scott Mitchell wrote. I think Wehrlein, however weak and shabby he felt, he should have been in that car. He should have driven it. And if I'd been his manager, I said, I don't care how you feel, take some drugs, man up, and get in the car and drive, because there's now a massive question mark. I think the idea that people will think through, oh, he did the sensible thing, is just not Formula One. I think he's made a huge career error.
I'd agree with that. Yeah, I think as well as Scott reasoned his argument that he made the sensible decision. This is Formula One, and perceptions count, as we know, rightly or wrongly, fairly or not. It's the question mark is there, and it's going to take him. It's going to take him a long time to shake that off. I think, especially in a Sauber.
I guess the question mark is what would have happened if. Because we saw he was pretty erratic on the Friday, and obviously he's lost the kind of prime period of his training. So let's say there'd been a bit more attrition. He was running around in 10th place for a valuable point, and he was just struggling, and he dropped it.
Yeah, but we all think back to Nigel Mansell collapsing on the line through heat exhaustion, Nelson Piquet collapsing on the podium. We've all got our memories of these drivers. Much more recently, Alonso and Trulli. There was that great shot that someone posted last year, wasn't there, from 2006, I think. Alonso and Trulli just absolutely broken at the end of the race. Fine if he'd broken. What if he'd pushed himself so hard that he had to retire? We'd have seen something that we might have doffed our caps to and said, well done, mate, you did everything you could as it happened. He just took himself out of the game, and I think, what's that about?
I guess the key is exactly where it actually
in his head,
etc. So I mean, I'm a little bit careful about the kind of phrase you use as the man up idea, and you've just got to do what you've got to do. I think in a lot of other sports where people pull out of things, sometimes footballers come back from injury and they say, well, they're training fully, but they're not up to full fitness because they've been out for 4 or 5 weeks, everyone else trained properly. That's kind of accepted. And I wonder whether, particularly with the more physical cars, whether it's a little bit too easy just to kind of be dismissive and say, well, obviously you should have done it. And the fact that Wehrlein has dropped out of China in advance also suggests that the problem there is fairly serious. I don't think we can for one moment think he will have done this lightly. This won't have been an offhand move. He will be very aware of the criticism, but he knows the importance of doing the job right.
Well, what he has to do now is destroy Marcus Ericsson for the rest of the season, and then there's no doubt left.
I think on the back of being overlooked in favour of Bottas for that drive, that they weren't willing to put their, take a chance on a basically a rookie, or even not a rookie, but essentially in terms of a front running car, very much a rookie. He was already there were already doubts in people's minds. I just think it came at the completely wrong time for his career to make that decision. And I accept that in other sports, stars put out through injury. But there was a case a few weeks ago, a Man United game. Marcus Rashford wasn't going to play because he was ill, and they were so short they actually got him down to London, and he did play. And so, well, why if he did play in the end, why did he call off in the first place? And there's those sort of question marks. Sometimes I think sports stars, it's too easy to pull out in situations like this, and I think he will regret that decision.
Well, certainly in terms of the boost that's given Giovinazzi, yes, because it's kind of let another driver put a bit of a marker down and actually be in people's minds as someone who's credible. So that is interesting. I guess the main thing is that perhaps had there been a bit more clarity in the build-up to the weekend after testing, if they raised a few flags, well, we're going to have to assess him after Friday practices, because you just don't know how kind of on the limit he was pushing it. The team probably made a little bit of an error in testing by not giving Wehrlein more intense running. The longest single run he had in the car was a stint of 12 laps, which wasn't anywhere near where it needed to be. So that was a real mistake, because they might have picked up this problem earlier and been able to pull Wehrlein out before the weekend, give Giovinazzi the full weekend, had they been onto that earlier.
In that case, that's a failure of management then, isn't it? Because going into the race weekend, once everything is set, if your drivers aren't right, then it doesn't matter how good your car is, you can't maximise your weekend. So someone at Sauber should have made that call a lot earlier and said, you know what, our guy's not going to be fit for Australia, we'll sub him in advance. And then it takes all the pressure off Pascal Wehrlein. You can say he's got a neck injury or whatever the true cause of his non-performance or inability to compete was, and then he's not stigmatised.
I'd agree with that completely, and that would also let you have Giovinazzi having the Friday as well, which potentially could have had an even stronger performance. So yeah, I think we can definitely all agree on that one. The other interesting question is, obviously we haven't really talked about the midfield. We've jumped from the front to the back. We talked a lot in the last podcast about Williams' performance. I guess the team that slipped a little bit under the radar in a way was Haas. Grosjean stuck at 6 on the grid with one of his mega qualifying laps that we always know he's capable of, but we didn't really get to see Haas find its place in that battle. What are we expecting to see in China?
I find that impossible to predict from what we saw in Melbourne. I think
expert punditry.
Thank you.
But what do you know?
I'm being honest. I know that you're a fool.
Fair.
Williams themselves think they are clearly fourth, and they're in a better position to analyse it than me. They think they're nowhere near the top 3, but well clear of everybody else. So maybe that's a true indication of where Haas are at. I mean, a quick driver on a hot lap isn't the same as having consistent mid-grid pace, is it? But Haas were frequently surprising last year, especially at the start and at the end of the year. They lost their way a bit mid-season. They're a very competent, solid team, and we know the basis of that car is a very good one. And Roman's a driver who could easily win races in the right car. So, there's plenty of good stuff there. Again, China will tell us a lot.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think it's way too early to know from one race. It was encouraging to see how well he was running and how high up he was running until it all went wrong. But I'd be optimistic to think it was going to be week in, week out, that kind of performance. But let's see.
I'm going to have to ask people for predictions for China, which I know is a fool's errand, really. But having a look at the odds for the race, Lewis Hamilton is still favourite, just 6-5. Sebastian Vettel 13-8, and you've got Valtteri Bottas 13-2 and Kimi Räikkönen 9-1. That's how the odds are shaking out. So it's kind of closed up between Mercedes and Ferrari. If you had to put your money on the line, put your week's pay packet on the line, which drive would you be putting it on, and why?
I'd probably be a little bit boring actually and go for Lewis, Bottas 1-2, followed by Vettel and Räikkönen. I think although they were pushed hard and were well and truly rattled and actually beaten fair and square in Melbourne, I think in China Mercedes will have enough of an edge to put the red cars back in their place. I suspect. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect it's going to be a Lewis Bottas one too.
And Prof, or Anthony, should I say?
Yes, Edward. I'd go along with that. And I'm just thinking back to, I think it was 2012 when Nico won his first race for Mercedes in China, and he won by a minute, basically. So within that team, there is a deep knowledge of how to absolutely hit the sweet spot around that circuit. And you just kind of think it's the sort of very modern Formula One circuit. There's nothing odd about it other than it's got long straights, but it's sort of an F1 circuit by numbers. And Mercedes is nothing if not a massively data-driven organisation. I think they'll nail it again.
Interesting to see where Bottas is in terms of how close he gets to Lewis this time.
I'd like to see him closer.
Yeah, I mean, he was respectable in Australia, but you could see in his face, I think he was a little bit disappointed that he wasn't closer. So he needs to step it up, doesn't he?
Yeah, definitely. It was a good, solid start, but I don't see him just as a complete way behind Hamilton number 2. I think he's somebody who can be bothering him on occasion, so he needs to be closer than that. Well, with just a few days to go until the start of practice in Shanghai, it won't be long before we get into the second chapter of the Vettel versus Hamilton rivalry and get a few more answers to our questions. In the meantime, for all the latest news from F1 and the rest of the motorsport world, head to autosport.com. And don't forget to pick up a copy of Autosport magazine, out every Thursday, and F1 Racing, out every month. And remember, you can subscribe to this podcast via iTunes and from most other well-known podcast suppliers. From myself, Edd Straw, and my guests Damien Smith and Anthony Rowlinson, better known as Prof, thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week with another Autosport podcast. Music is 6am by Treelo, written by Marcus Simmons. See soundcloud.com/Treelo Music.
Is this the bit where we talk rubbish and you put it on the extras?
Well, sometimes people say nonsense during the podcast. Sometimes they say it before it. But you really need Stuart Codling in.
Well, we could talk about the Channel Islands for 10 minutes if you want.
Other holiday destinations.
And I can say, yeah.
What's your favourite island?
Anthropomorphised.
And other such words.
Yeah.
I think this is perfect.
Conjugation.
This is perfect nonsense to put at the end of it.